The early days of May brought a rare spell of golden weather to the village of Charnley St. Mary. The hedgerows were bursting with new green, the bluebells carpeting the woodlands like something out of a fairy tale, and the older residents, ever cautious, finally began to shed their winter shawls and speak openly of an early summer. It was on just such a morning that the annual church picnic took place, tradition older than the vicar himself and twice as enthusiastically attended. The setting was perfect. Bluebell Hollow lay at the edge of the village where the woods sloped down toward the stream, and at its heart stood Bluebell Cottage, charming, rose-covered house half swallowed by wisteria and ivy, with a thatched roof that never seemed to age. It belonged to Mrs. Iris Lonscombe, a widow of considerable age and firmer opinions, who had lived in the cottage since before the war and often declared she would die there just to spite the gas-board. On that particular Sunday, Bluebell Cottage's garden had been transformed, with trestle tables and gingham bunting. Children darted through the wildflowers. Elderly gentlemen from the parish council struggled with folding chairs, and the vicar, red-faced and cheerful, delivered a long-winded blessing over a lemon sponge. Miss Marple, seated beneath a cherry tree with a plate of seed cake and a good view of the proceedings, observed it all with a soft, amused eye. She noted how Mrs. Cresswell, whose husband had once sold umbrellas in Bath, nodded politely at every word the vicar said while sneaking looks toward Iris Lonscombe's tea tray. She saw young Thomas Lonscombe, great-nephew of the hostess, standing far too close to that new girl from the post office, and how their conversation was marked by awkward laughter and the quick, furtive glances of people who believed themselves unseen. But perhaps most curious was Iris Lonscombe herself. She was never idle. That much was known, but on this day she seemed particularly distracted. Though her tone was lively, her eyes wandered. Though she offered sandwiches and poured tea with her usual authority, there was something beneath the surface, something tight and wary. Miss Marple watched her pour a cup of tea for Colonel Faraday, and then, just for the briefest second, glanced toward the windows of the cottage, as though checking or waiting. It was in the late afternoon, just as the final pots of tea were being drained, and the Mrs. Crouch began discussing hymn selections with the vicar's wife, that the cry came. It came from inside the cottage, and it was not the sharp cry of surprise or even injury. It was a wailer, deep, wrenched sound that stopped every voice mid-sentence. People stood, plates were dropped. A child burst into tears without knowing why. Within seconds, Mrs. Cresswell was already halfway up the garden path, followed closely by the Colonel and a trembling Thomas Lonscombe. Miss Marple did not rush. She gathered her shawl, steadied her feet, and walked briskly toward the open door of Bluebell Cottage. By the time she entered, the hallway was full. The vicar was saying something about fetching a doctor, and someone else, young Alice from the greengrocer's, was crying in the corner in the parlour. The crowd parted slowly for her. There, on the settee beside the fireplace, lay Mrs. Iris Lonscombe, still, silent, her head lolled unnaturally to the side. Her teacup had spilled onto the rug, and just beside her hand, only partially concealed beneath the corner of a crocheted cushion, was a small glass bottle, tipped on its side. Miss Marple stepped forward, eyes narrowing just slightly. No one spoke, not even the vicar. It was Dr. Pendry, who confirmed it an hour later. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Peaceful, I imagine. Likely her heart." Inspector Denham, summoned from the larger town of Marston, had already begun asking polite but pointed questions. He was a tall, angular man with a kind face, but a methodical mind. He tapped his notebook gently as he addressed the gathering in the garden. "She was quite well this morning?" he asked. "She was full of life," said Mrs. Cresswell. "She was handing out sausage rolls only moments before. Anyone notice anything unusual?" Thomas, pale-faced, spoke up. "She seemed nervous, jumpier than usual. She kept asking if anyone had been in the house. That's true?" Denham turned to Miss Crouch, who nodded slowly. "She asked me if I'd seen the blue envelope," she said. "I thought it was a joke." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual laugh. Denham scribbled something down. "And the bottle," he added. "Anyone recognize it?" "It's lavender tonic," said Miss Marple gently. "Mrs. Lonscombe always kept it for her nerves. But that bottle was nearly full last week when I stopped in. It seemed ... significantly emptier this afternoon." Denham looked up. "You believe she took something more than tonic?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that someone else may have added to it." There was a hush. Miss Crouch gasped, straightened slightly. "You're suggesting foul play." Miss Marple tilted her head, that familiar gleam behind her spectacles. "I'm suggesting," she said softly, "that Mrs. Lonscombe did not die of fright over a picnic." By the following morning, the entire village of Charnley St. Mary was humming like a beehive, disturbed. Not a single window remained uncurtained by 8 o'clock, and not a single person could walk to the greengrocer without being stopped at least once by a concerned, wide-eyed neighbor hoping to confirm or deny what they had already heard. "Iris Lonscombe, dead," gasped Mrs. Quibber, as she handed Miss Lavinia Crouch a wrapped parcel of barley sugar. "And right in the middle of the picnic. I say, it's like something out of one of those American dramas." "It was the middle of the afternoon, not the drama hour," Miss Crouch snapped, though she herself had already retold the story 3 times between breakfast and elevenses. "She seemed perfectly fine," muttered Colonel Faraday at the butcher's. "If anything, too spirited. Never trusted women who wore red lipstick after 70. "Do you think it was her heart, then?" asked Mr. Hackleton, adjusting his hat in the queue. The Colonel leaned closer. "Not likely." Pendry was evasive, and I heard the inspector's face went quite grave when Miss Marple pointed to that bottle. "Miss Marple was there?" Mr. Hackleton asked, eyes widening. "She was, indeed," the Colonel said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "And if she's looking thoughtful, you can be sure this wasn't just a matter of age and ill fortune." Miss Marple, for her part, was not speculating at all, at least not openly. She sat that morning in her usual chair by the window of the vicarage, knitting a moss-green scarf for her niece's newest grandchild, and drinking tea with Helena Cresswell, the vicar's wife. "It was all so sudden," Helena said, her brow furrowed. "Iris had that dreadful cough last winter, but she seemed stronger lately. She walked to the post office just last week." Miss Marple nodded, eyes on her knitting. "She was very particular about her household," she said after a pause. "Everything had its place. Every drawer was labelled. But I noticed, yesterday, that one drawer in her writing desk was ajar. Perhaps someone had borrowed something. Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "or perhaps someone had been looking for something." Helena looked up sharply. "Do you think?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Iris Lonscombe was frightened." Inspector Denham returned to the village later that afternoon, this time with a quiet constable in tow and a satchel full of papers. He began discreet inquiries, which, given the nature of the village, meant everyone knew he was making them before he reached his second doorstep. He first spoke to Thomas Lonscombe, Iris's great-nephew, who had recently moved into the village under the vague pretense of assisting with the estate. A thin, pale man in his mid-30s, with a hesitant voice and habit of smoothing his hair. Thomas answered every question with an uncomfortable exactitude. "She asked me to come," he said, "last December. Said the winters were getting too long. And was she in good health then? Denham asked. Yes, she had her spells, but nothing serious. Did she ever express concern for her safety? Thomas blinked. No, though she was oddly ... private of late. She didn't like me going into her sitting room when she wasn't in it. Do you know if she kept valuables there? She kept her will locked in the writing desk. I only know because she mentioned it during a spat over the chimney repair. Denham raised a brow. A spat, Thomas flushed. She wanted the cheapest builder possible. I said it wasn't safe. The inspector scribbled in his notebook, then added, "And what of the blue envelope?" Thomas stiffened. I don't know what that was. Something she mentioned in passing. Said she'd lost it. I thought she meant a letter. What sort of letter? I don't know. By the time Inspector Denham interviewed the Crouch sisters, the village had settled into its pattern of feigned normalcy. The Misses Crouch, Lavinia, and Joan were the twin terriers of village gossip, one a whisperer and the other a snapper. And between them they held a collective memory that spanned every scandal since the flood. Iris was secretive. Lavinia declared, "Always has been. You remember the affair with the gardener?" That wasn't proven, Joan muttered into her tea. Lavinia continued. She wouldn't let the cleaning woman upstairs unsupervised. Always hoarding things. Kept the curtains drawn when no one was home. What was her relationship with Thomas? Like Denham asked. Too close, Lavinia said at once. Too distant, Joan corrected. He was after the house, Lavinia insisted. You could smell it on him. Denham gave them both a measured look. Did either of you notice anyone unusual at the picnic? Joan frowned. That girl from the post office was in a sulk. Lavinia leaned forward. She went off toward the house during the second hymn. I saw her out the corner of my eye. Denham made a note of it. That evening, Miss Marple walked the quiet lane past Bluebell Cottage. The gates had been drawn shut, and the windows were dark, though a faint light glowed in the back kitchen. A constable was posted at the door, nodding politely as she passed. She did not approach. Instead, she turned down toward the hollow, where the bluebells were beginning to fade, their brilliant hues turning soft with age. There, beneath the shade of a beech tree, she paused. It had been here that Mrs. Lonscombe had last walked during the picnic, laughing, as she carried a tray of elderflower cordial, fussing over the sandwiches, watching the children race between the trees. But her eyes had not been on the games, they had been on the house. And Miss Marple had seen, in that moment, a flicker of worry. A woman whose fortress was no longer her own. Who feared not illness, nor age, but discovery. The question, Miss Marple thought, was what she feared. Being discovered, and by whom? The following days passed with a quiet, watchful tension in Charnley St. Mary. The flowers in Bluebell Hollow began to wilt under early summer heat. The bunting from the ill-fated picnic was taken down by the parish boys without ceremony, and the hush that hung over the village was now seasoned with questions. The coroner's report had not yet been made public. But word had spread, one could never quite say how, that a foreign substance had been found in Mrs. Lavender tonic, something bitter, something not meant for calming nerves, but for extinguishing them altogether by Wednesday. Whispers of poison began to ripple through the village like the chime of unseen bells. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sipped her tea in thoughtful silence. The vicar's wife, Helena, stood by the window, peering out as two boys passed by on bicycles. They say the will's being examined, she said quietly, that Thomas may have been written out. Miss Marple gave a non-committal hum. Helena turned. Don't you find it odd, how sudden he was to take charge the moment she fell ill? He was directing the doctor and the inspector before anyone else had even understood she was gone. Some men, Miss Marple said mildly, find control comforting, particularly when they feel it slipping away. Do you think he did it? Helena asked, not for the first time. Miss Marple set her cup down. I think, she said, it is not always the one who shouts or sulks that needs watching. Often it's the one who stays very still and hopes not to be asked. Inspector Denham, meanwhile, was back at Bluebell Cottage, his brow furrowed, a slim file tucked under his arm. He stepped inside the parlour where the constable had been stationed, and nodded toward the writing desk. It's locked, the constable reported. We've not forced it. Thought you'd prefer to wait. Denham nodded, produced a small brass keyra covered from the kitchen drawer and turned it in the lock. The top drawer creaked open. Inside, neatly labelled folders, a leather-bound diary, 2 fountain pens, and a bundle of envelopes tied with ribbon, blue ribbon. The inspector untied the bundle. Each envelope bore a different name. Most were blank inside, but one thicker, heavier was addressed, simply, to be opened in the event of my death. He opened it. Inside was a short letter in a shaky hand. If this reaches you, then I have met with what I feared. I know I am being watched, not from outside, but within. There are things in this house I can no longer trust, not even my own memories. There is someone who wants me gone. I believe I know who, but I have no proof. Not yet. The blue envelope contains the rest. Iris Lonscombe looked up sharply. The blue envelope. The constable looked around the desk. Then beneath it, there's nothing matching that description here. Sir Denham frowned. Then, it's been taken, by whom? Denham glanced at the diary and said, more to himself than anyone, that's the next question. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the post office. That the young woman behind the counter, Miss Edith Crane, was carefully stamping a stack of parish newsletters. She was tidy, well-mannered, and generally known for being polite to elders and impatient with anyone else. Miss Marple waited patiently until Edith noticed her. Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. Good morning, dear. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, just the usual post. Miss Marple leaned on the counter lightly. I suppose you're rather relieved. Things have calmed a little. Edith gave a non-committal shrug. I suppose you knew Mrs. Lonscombe, didn't you? Edith nodded. Of course, everyone does. And you were at the picnic. Edith paused for half a beat too long. Yes, Miss Marple smiled. I hear you stepped away during the hymn. Edith's shoulders tightened. Only for a moment. I'd dropped my purse. I thought it might be near the kitchen garden. Of course, such a terrible thing to lose. So many small essentials in those bag-slip bomb, spare coins, letters, ... I didn't lose anything, Edith said. Too quickly. Miss Marple nodded gently. That's good to hear. It's dreadful when things go missing. She allowed the silence to stretch. Then, changing the subject completely, she remarked, the daffodils in the South Lane have come up rather late this year, don't you think? Edith blinked, caught off guard. Oh yes, I suppose they have. Miss Marple smiled again. Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful. By that afternoon, Inspector Denham had compiled a short but pointed list of persons of interest. At the top, Thomas Lonscombe, motivation, inheritance, opportunity, suspicious urgency. Below him, Miss Edith Crane. Connection, proximity to the house, access to letters, evasive behavior. A third name was circled but not underlined. Dr. Pendry, not because of suspicion, exactly, but because Denham could not quite forget how the man had appeared. To calm. There was something in the way he had stepped aside at the scene, Something a touch too professional for a doctor of such a small parish. Denham sighed and closed his notebook. It wasn't just about poison or wills, it was about people, and the secrets they carried in daylight. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour and looked over her own notes, a list of names, a diagram of seating at the picnic, a short, underlined phrase, blue envelope. She believed, as she often did, that the answer lay not in what was signed but what was moved, not the teacup, not the bottle, but the letter that had vanished, and the silence it had left behind. The village of Charnley St. Mary, though small in number, was mighty in rumour. And as Inspector Denham quietly built his case, the villagers began doing the same in their parlours and behind their half-drawn curtains. For most, the matter was now simple. Someone in the garden had poisoned Mrs. Lonscombe, someone she had trusted, and there were only so many hands that had served her tea. It must have been Thomas, declared Mrs. Quibber with theatrical certainty in the queue at the grocer's. It's always the heir. I've read enough novels to know. Too obvious, sniffed Lavinia Crouch, and too cowardly. You saw him during the inquest. He looked ready to faint. It's always the ones who look faint, said Mr. Hackleton, eyes narrowing. They don't have to do the hard work of hiding it, they let everyone believe they haven't the stomach. Miss Crane had her reasons, murmured Mrs. Crayswell. She was close to Mrs. Lonscombe, too close. Some said, it's always the quiet ones. No one mentioned the bottle. No one had seen it taken. But somehow, everyone had formed a picture of it in their mind, small, glassy, and fatal. At Bluebell Cottage, Inspector Denham was seated once again in the Nowsomber parlour. Across from Thomas Lonscombe, the young man looked drawn, his hands restless in his lap. She was my great-aunt, he said. Do people think I don't feel anything? I lived with her for 6 months. She gave me a place when I needed one. You've been in some difficulty, haven't you? Denham asked, not unkindly. Thomas flushed. Yes, but I never hid that. I told her about my debts. She offered to help. But she didn't, Denham pointed out. She revised her will. You were left a token sum. Did you know that? No, not even a hint. Thomas shook his head. I thought she trusted me. Denham made a note. And what about the writing desk? Did you ever see the blue envelope? No. Did she ever speak of being afraid? Thomas hesitated. Once she said someone had been meddling. I thought she meant Edith. They had grown close, but she said lately the girl was prying. Did she say what the girl was looking for? No, but she stopped leaving her letters out. Locked her drawers, that sort of thing. Did Miss Crane ever have cause to be angry with her? Thomas gave a soft, awkward laugh. They all had cause. The Crouch sisters thought Iris owed them money for their library fund. Mrs. Cresswell said she'd been promised a family brooch. Even the vicar's wife said Iris changed her mind about donating the piano. Denham looked up. She made a great many promises, did she? She made a great many enemies, Thomas replied, almost sadly. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had taken her embroidery to the post office, ostensibly to ask about a missing parcel. Though in truth, to better observe Miss Edith Crane in her natural habitat, the young woman was polite as ever. But there was a stiffness to her now, an edge. I've told the inspector everything, she said, adjusting a stack of stamps. I only stepped away from the picnic for a moment. I didn't poison anyone. No, dear, Miss Marple replied kindly. But you were fond of Iris Lonscombe, weren't you? Edith looked up sharply. She helped me, she said. I had no family here. She introduced me around, invited me to tea, and lately, Edith hesitated. She became difficult, distrustful. She said I talked too much. She locked her drawers, accused me of borrowing a necklace I hadn't touched. She accused you?" Miss Marple asked, not surprised. Edith nodded. "I was angry, hurt, but I didn't want her dead." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Wanting and doing are very different things. But tell me, did she ever mention something she'd hidden? A letter, perhaps?" Edith looked away. "Only once. She said she had written something for protection. I assumed she meant a will. Perhaps she meant both," Miss Marple said softly. Later that day, Inspector Denham summoned Dr. Pendry for a brief interview. The doctor arrived with his usual composed air, black bag in hand, a slight frown on his weathered face. "She died quickly," he said, when asked again. "Symptoms were faint, lethargy, shallow breath, no violent reactions. You're still certain it was poisoning?" "Yes. The lab confirmed traces of a plant-based alkaloid dizzily dissolved in liquid, but rare, untraceable unless specifically tested for. Would the average person know how to obtain it? Unlikely, but someone with gardening experience might." Denham raised an eyebrow. "And did Iris Lonscombe have such experience?" "She grew everything herself," Pendry said. "Had a whole shed of dried herbs and wildflowers. So, she could have dosed herself." Pendry shook his head. "Not this compound. It was introduced recently. In a separate container." Denham leaned back. "One last thing," he said. "You were the first to examine the body. Did you notice anything odd aside from the obvious?" Pendry paused. "She had a key in her pocket. Not to the writing desk. Something smaller. And where is it now?" Pendry looked uncomfortable. "I left it. I assumed the police would take inventory. But when I returned later, it was gone." That evening, Miss Marple walked home from the vicarage under a rising moon. She considered all she had learned: Thomas's resentment, Edith's betrayal, the letter that vanished, and the key that no longer existed. The question was no longer who had a motive, it was who had known about the letter, and who had been desperate enough to ensure it never came to light, in a village full of whispers. Miss Marple now listened, not for what was said, but what was missing. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to wander. She often remarked, quite truthfully, that the legs required as much exercise as the mind. And so it was on Thursday afternoon that she took a turn through the narrow footpath behind Bluebell Cottage, not to interfere, of course, but to reflect. She brought no notebook, only a small pair of gloves and the same handbag she had carried to the garden party. Her aim, she told herself, was to pass by the orchard trees where Iris Lonscombe had walked before her collapse. But as she approached the back gate, she noticed something odd. It was a folded linen napkin, partially obscured in the long grass near the edge of the garden. No one else seemed to have noticed it. Miss Marple bent carefully, retrieved it, and gave it a light shake. The napkin was of fine make, monogrammed with an embroidered L. It bore no food stains, but a faint, pale brown mark clung to one corner, a blot that did not look like T or L. She sniffed it gently, noting the sharp tang of something plant-like medicinal not lavender. Something sharper, earthier. Carefully, she wrapped the napkin in a clean handkerchief and tucked it into her bag. A moment later, she heard a step behind her. It was Inspector Denham. "You have a talent for turning up where the investigation leads," he said mildly. Miss Marple smiled. "And you, Inspector, have a talent for letting ladies believe they are not under suspicion while watching them very closely." Denham gave a slight bow. "I came to walk the garden path again," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes the memory needs fresh air. And what has it remembered?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag and produced the handkerchief napkin. This was hidden in the grass. near the spot where Iris Lonscombe stumbled after pouring tea. Denham accepted it, unwrapping the linen with interest. When he saw the faint mark, he raised an eyebrow. "You think this was used?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps not by the victim, but by someone nearby. Someone who needed to remove the trace of something quickly, perhaps from a bottle, or their fingers." Denham nodded slowly. "And no one's reported it missing?" "No one's said a word," she replied. Back at the station, the napkin was handed over to the lab. While the results would take days to confirm, Denham's interest had been sharply piqued. The theory of a subtle, premeditated poisoning was becoming more plausible with each passing hour. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned home and made herself a modest supper: boiled egg, toast, and chamomile tea. But she barely touched it. Her mind was turning over something else. The napkin, not the tea, but the placement of things. It was a memory from the picnic, something that had struck her as odd, even at the time, but had been pushed aside by the chaos of Iris Lonscombe's collapse. The tea tray. When Iris had poured for the Colonel and then for herself, the tray had seemed lighter than usual, incomplete. She remembered distinctly. 3 cups, 2 saucers, not 4, not 5, but 3. And yet, Iris had always served tea in pairs, one for each guest, one for herself. Miss Marple rose, crossed to her desk, and retrieved a small slip of paper where she had noted guests seated in the immediate vicinity that afternoon. The Colonel, Miss Crane, Thomas, and one other, Mrs. Creswell, but Mrs. Creswell had declined tea. "I've just had some at the vicarage," she had said, pressing a hand to her stomach. "I'll be sick with another drop." Miss Marple murmured aloud. To the empty room. So why did Iris prepare for cups? And who had drunk from the cup that went missing? The next morning, Miss Marple made an excuse to visit the Creswell. She brought a jar of gooseberry preserve as peace offering and found Mrs. Creswell in the parlour, arranging flowers with meticulous care. "Geraniums, this time," the woman said, without looking up. "Iris always liked dahlias, but I've never trusted a flower that pretends to be something it's not." "Quite right," Miss Marple said warmly. "Dahlias have a way of drawing too much attention." Mrs. Creswell looked up at her. "Is this a social call?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied, "though I did wonder if you might help me with a small recollection." "At the picnic," Miss Marple said, "you mentioned having had tea earlier at the vicarage." "I did." "And you refused Mrs. Lonscombe's?" Mrs. Creswell nodded. "I did." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Then I'm curious, dear, what happened to the 4th cup?" The woman blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "There were 4 cups on the tray," Miss Marple said gently, "but only 3 accounted for. Iris, the Colonel, and Miss Crane, I believe. You refused. And yet, when I went into the parlour, there were only 2 cups spilled." Mrs. Creswell's hands tensed slightly around the geranium stem. "It's quite possible," she said briskly, "that someone moved one in the confusion." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, quite possible." She stood. "Well, thank you for the geraniums and the conversation." She left before the woman could protest. Back at the station, Denham had narrowed the suspects to 3. Thomas motive clear, means uncertain. Edith Crane opportunity plausible, emotions volatile, and now Mrs. Creswell, who had proximity, poise, and the curious absence of a teacup. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting later that evening, made a final note in her margin. It wasn't the poison itself that was hidden. It was the intended recipient. By Saturday morning, the mood in Charnley St. Mary had shifted from curiosity to quiet unease. The usual rhythm of village life, markets, tea visits, and church choir rehearsals continued. But there was a sense that something essential had been knocked loose. Behind every polite smile was suspicion. Behind every closed door, a conversation no one would dare say aloud in public. At the heart of it all sat Bluebell Cottage. Now under official seal, though that did nothing to stop the stream of glances tossed in its direction or the murmured theories passed beneath breath. And while Inspector Denham spent his morning reviewing forensic notes and confirming that the napkin had indeed been tainted with plant-based alkaloid traces, Miss Marple took a different approach. She paid visits. Her first stop was Thomas Lonscombe. She found him in the churchyard, oddly enough, straightening flowers at the family plot-on act, which struck her as more self-conscious than filial. He turned at her approach, forcing a faint smile. "Miss Marple, Mr. Lonscombe," she returned, nodding toward the graves. "A little early for memorials, isn't it? I come here when I need to think." Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her. "And what is it you need to think about today?" He gave a tired shrug. "My aunt, my future. Whether I'm a suspect or simply a convenience." "You feel wrongly accused?" "I feel I'm in a story where I'm expected to be the villain." He looked up, jaw tense. "I didn't poison her." Miss Marple regarded him a long moment. "Were you aware your aunt had written a letter naming someone she feared?" His eyes widened slightly. "No, she mentioned a blue envelope." Thomas swallowed. "She was acting strangely. I told the inspector she was locking drawers, hiding things, jumping at shadows." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but fear doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means guilt." His brow furrowed. Guilt. Did she ever speak of something she regretted? Something she was afraid might return to her doorstep? Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away. "She asked me once if I'd told anyone about the Frenchwoman." Miss Marple tilted her head. "What Frenchwoman?" "She never said her name. Just that there was someone, years ago, she'd wronged. She was worried that person had come to the village." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did someone?" "I don't know," he said. "But she became a different person after that." Her second stop was the post office. This time, Miss Crane did not look pleased to see her. "I told you everything already." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "But sometimes people don't realize what they know." Edith crossed her arms. "Did you know Mrs. Lonscombe feared someone from her past had come back?" "No," Edith said quickly. "She never told me that. But she accused you of borrowing something. A necklace? A stupid, hideous thing. I would never have touched it." Miss Marple waited. Edith's shoulders slumped. She accused everyone of something. In the end, the last week was awful. She'd go quiet mid-sentence. "Once, she asked if I knew how to hide a body." Miss Marple blinked. "And how did you respond?" "I thought she was joking. I laughed. And then she just stared at me." "Did you think she was losing her mind?" "I thought she was afraid of something she couldn't name." Miss Marple nodded slowly. And at that moment, she decided to visit one more person. Mrs. Cresswell lived in a handsome cottage with lace curtains, polished brass, and a wall of family portraits that watched every visitor with prim judgment. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted with forced cheer. "I do hope you haven't come about that dreadful picnic again." Miss Marple removed her gloves. "I have, actually." Mrs. Cresswell's smile froze. "I wanted to ask about your connection to Iris. We were friends. Church committee, flower arrangements. You know how it is. I heard she once promised you a brooch." Mrs. Cresswell waved her hand. "Nonsense. A little trinket. Nothing of real value. Yet you argued about it." "She changed her mind. Said she would leave it to someone else." "I was disappointed, not angry." Miss Marple watched her. "Did you take tea at the picnic?" "I told you I had already." Had tea at the vicarage? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And yet, there were 4 cups poured. I couldn't say what happened to the 4th. Miss Marple took a step closer. There was also a key missing. Small, taken from her pocket, likely after she collapsed, the key to the drawer where she kept the blue envelope. Mrs. Cresswell's face tightened. I know nothing about any envelope. I never said you did, Miss Marple said kindly. But it is curious, isn't it? How many people seem to know exactly what they didn't see. That evening, the village quieted early. Only a faint breeze stirred the hedgerows and ivy on the old stone walls. The church bell tolled 6 times. Lamps flickered on behind curtains, and at the vicarage, Miss Marple wrote 3 names in her notebook. She drew a line between 2 of them, then circled the 3rd. She stared at it a long time. Not the one who stood to gain, she murmured, but the one who feared the truth would outlive the lie. The first true rain of June arrived late Sunday morning, abrupt, wind-lashed storm that soaked the village green, stripped the last petals from the rosebeds, and gave the postman a cold he would grumble about for weeks. But inside the stone walls of Charnley St. Mary's little police office, the mood was anything but sluggish. Inspector Denham had received a parcel. It had come from Iris Lonscombe's solicitor, a dry, precise man in Marston who had found the contents of her safe deposit box while updating the will. Inside the package were several deeds, a sealed will revision, and most importantly a letter, addressed to one Miss Edith Crane but never posted. The envelope bore no stamp, no ink smudge. It had been written, then deliberately held back. Denham read it once. Then again, then he sent for Miss Marple. I'm not one for melodrama, Denham said, as Miss Marple took a seat opposite his desk. But this might be our twist. He passed her the letter carefully. She unfolded the thin cream paper and read the words silently. Dear Edith, you have been kind to me. You've stayed for tea when others left, and you've smiled when I couldn't remember why I was frowning. But I must speak plainly now. You've asked questions lately. Too many. You said you'd heard about the incident in Paris. That word should never be spoken again. It's buried, and I've paid the price. If you mention it once more, if you threaten to tell Thomas or the solicitor, we'll see to it that you never step foot in my house again. Be warned. Some truths are more dangerous than lies. Iris Lonscomus Marple read the letter a 3rd time before folding it with care. So it wasn't just guilt she feared, she said softly. It was exposure. Denham nodded. What do you make of this incident in Paris? I think, said Miss Marple, it may explain everything. Miss Marple went first to the vicarage. It was her usual stop when sorting thoughts, and Mrs. Cresswell was conveniently absent at the church kitchen. There, she found Helena brewing tea and polishing silver in a way that meant something was worrying her. Have you seen Edith Crane? Miss Marple asked. Helena shook her head. Not since Friday. She called in ill Saturday morning and hasn't reopened the post. Miss Marple frowned. She seemed disturbed when I last saw her. Do you think she's run off? She's hardly the sort, Helena replied, though the doubt in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Miss Marple said nothing. But after tea, she walked straight to the post office. The building was dark, but not locked. Edith's small lodgings were connected to the back room, a modest set of rooms with threadbare curtains and the faint scent of rosewater. Miss Marple knocked gently, then opened the door. Inside, the room was empty, but recently so. A bag lay open on the bed, half-packed. A drawer was ajar, and on the small wooden desk, a torn scrap of paper fluttered in the window breeze. I never meant to be part of it. I just wanted the sentence trailed off. Miss Marple picked up the paper and turned it over. On the back was a list of names, 3 names. Hers, Thomas's, and Iris's. All were underlined. She folded the note and left, her heart heavy. Edith wasn't guilty, but she was frightened. Later that day, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to Dr. Pendry. She found him in his surgery, examining samples under lamplight. When she entered, he greeted her without surprise. "You've come about Iris Lonscombe," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I've found something disquieting." She handed him the note, then told him of the letter. He read both, in silence. "Paris," he murmured, "I had wondered. You know something? Only that Iris lived there briefly in the 1930s. She never spoke of it, except once, when she mentioned she'd never go back. Did she ever speak of a child?" Pendry looked sharply at her. "No, but she once asked about infant records." "Years ago," Miss Marple nodded, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "I believe," she said, "that there was a child, an illegitimate one, possibly a scandal, involving a family of standing. Something buried, paid for, hidden." Pendry set down the letter. "And you think someone uncovered it?" "I think Edith found something in the house. Something Iris didn't want her to know." "Then why would Edith run?" "Because she saw what happened to someone who got too close to the truth." That evening, a storm rolled back over the village, thundering low above the hills. At the vicarage, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching lightning flash behind the steeple. She had begun with a puzzle of cups and drawers. But now, the mystery had teeth. The murder wasn't about inheritance, it was about exposure. Someone had tried to erase a sin too long buried, and Iris Lonscombe had died not for her wealth but for her secrets. Rain still fell softly the next morning, veiling Charnley St. Mary in a grey mist that made the hedges drip like tears and the church bell sound farther away than usual. It was the kind of weather that hushed gossip and quieted even the nosiest of neighbours. Miss Marple, however, was wide awake. She stood in the sitting room of the vicarage, looking over a tray of objects she had arranged herself: a teacup, a folded napkin, an empty envelope, and an old brass key she had borrowed from the vicar's garden shed, not identical to the one missing from Iris Lonscombe's pocket, but close enough in weight and colour to serve its purpose. Helena Cresswell watched her with thinly veiled curiosity. "You're setting a trap," she said, almost admiringly. "I prefer to think of it," said Miss Marple, "as a test of temperament. And you really believe someone will react to that key? If they believe it was the key." She picked up the envelope next. "And if I'm correct, they'll also recognize this. I've written nothing inside, but they won't know that." Helena shivered slightly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Miss Marple said, "once you understand how desperately people work to maintain a lie, and how little it takes to make them think it's come undone." The bait was set in the vicarage sitting-room that afternoon. Miss Marple sent polite invitations to 3 individuals: Thomas Lonscombe, Mrs. Cresswell, and Dr. Pendry. "A brief conversation," she said, regarding the late Mrs. Lonscombe's correspondence. They arrived on time, each visibly intrigued and slightly wary. Thomas entered first, a rain-spattered umbrella in hand and nervous energy humming about him like static. He nodded curtly at Miss Marple and took a seat near the hearth. Mrs. Cresswell followed, her expression taut and her hat askew. She looked around the room sharply before settling in with her handbag clutched like a shield. Dr. Pendry arrived last, composed as ever, nodding to each occupant before choosing the armchair nearest the window. The objects on the tray, placed conspicuously upon a small table, drew each of their eyes. Miss Marple made no mention of them. Instead, She spoke in her usual gentle voice. "Thank you all for coming. I wished to ask if any of you had further thoughts about the blue envelope." Thomas looked startled. "You found it?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Mrs. Cresswell shifted in her seat. "I was under the impression it was still missing." "I never saw it," Dr. Pendry added neutrally. Miss Marple tilted her head, curious. "Then, that all of you know exactly what I'm referring to." A silence settled. "Of course," she continued, "I might be wrong. It may have been destroyed, or passed along, or even hidden again." Thomas swallowed visibly. "I'm not accusing anyone," she added lightly, "merely wondering what one might do if they discovered that a key to the drawer where Iris Lonscombe kept her private documents had resurfaced." She gestured almost carelessly to the brass key on the tray. Mrs. Cresswell's eyes narrowed. Thomas leaned forward, then pulled back again. Only Dr. Pendry remained motionless, his gaze unreadable. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch once more. "Would anyone like to see it?" No one moved. Then Mrs. Cresswell reached forward, snatched the key, and turned it over in her gloved hand. "Is it real?" Miss Marple smiled. "Real enough." Mrs. Cresswell set it down with a snap. "Then you should give it to the police." "I intend to. But I thought it best to see whether it prompted any memories." She reached for the envelope next. Just as this might, Thomas sat back quickly, as if the envelope might bite him. Mrs. Cresswell's nostrils flared. Dr. Pendry's expression finally shifted, if only slightly. "You're suggesting," he said, "that one of us knew what was in that envelope." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said calmly, "that someone feared it, and that fear ... drove them to action." Mrs. Cresswell stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. I will not be made a party to theatre." Thomas followed, mumbling something about wasted time. Only Dr. Pendry lingered. "You're very clever," he said quietly. "I'm not clever," Miss Marple replied. "I'm simply old, and I've learned that people rarely panic about things that aren't true." After they left, Helena returned to the sitting room and found Miss Marple quietly wrapping the key and envelope back in her handkerchief. "No confession?" she asked. "No," Miss Marple replied. "But one of them couldn't stop looking at the tray. And one of them never looked at it once." Helena frowned. "Isn't that strange?" "It's very strange," Miss Marple said, "because even the innocent would be curious. But the guilty, the truly guilty, often believe that if they don't see a thing, it can't see them either." She looked up, eyes bright. "Now I know who it is." That evening, Inspector Denham received a note. "Inspector, if you still have the writing desk from Bluebell Cottage in your possession, I suggest you remove the lining from the middle drawer. I believe you'll find the original blue envelope there. It was never stolen, only cleverly tucked away. Yours sincerely, J. Inspector Denham stood at the center of the drawing room in Bluebell Cottage, the same room where Iris Lonscombe had died. But today, the air was different. Not tragic, but sharp, expectant. 3 chairs had been placed around the tea table. They were not labeled, but the message was clear. Thomas Lonscombe arrived first, nervous as ever, rubbing his hands along his trousers. Then came Mrs. Cresswell, primly dressed, a tight-lipped expression of reluctant indignation on her face. Finally, Dr. Pendry entered, polite and composed, nodding to both with equal reserve. Miss Marple entered last. She took her usual seat beside the hearth, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Inspector Denham cleared his throat. "I believe it's time we settled the matter of Iris Lonscombe's death," he said. There was a ripple of breath held, then released. "New evidence has come to light," he continued. "The original blue envelope, thought missing, was discovered yesterday tucked inside the false lining of Mrs. Lonscombe's writing desk. It contains a letter addressed to her solicitor and a second, more troubling document. He glanced down at the table. It names a person. Thomas looked up sharply. Mrs. Cresswell stiffened. Only Dr. Pendry remained still. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice calm and unmistakably final. Iris Lonscombe was being blackmailed. A pause she spent most of her later years dreading. The return of a secret she had worked hard to bury, an affair, long ago in Paris, with a married man of political standing. There was a child. The child was removed, silenced, in the ways these things were silenced back then. Miss Marple glanced at Thomas. I believe your aunt was terrified that her great-nephew, her closest living relation, would learn the truth. She believed that such a revelation would destroy what little trust existed between you. Thomas swallowed. She never told me anything. No, said Miss Marple, but someone else tried to. She turned her gaze to Mrs. Cresswell. You found the letter perhaps during one of your many helpful visits, and you saw the opportunity. Double quotes. Mrs. Cresswell's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying, said Miss Marple, that you saw in Iris's desperation a way to reclaim something you felt you'd been denied, a brooch, perhaps, or her favor. But when she refused to comply, you took matters into your own hands. Inspector Denham spoke then. The forensic report confirms the presence of poison, not just in the lavender tonic but on the edge of one teacup, a cup that was wiped clean, with a napkin found in the grass, a napkin bearing a faint trace of hellebore, a highly toxic plant. Mrs. Cresswell stood. You have no proof I touched that napkin. No, said Miss Marple gently. But you have no alibi for the precise moment when the tray was prepared. Thomas stared. So, she meant to poison Iris. No, said Miss Marple, she meant to poison you. There was a stunned silence. Denham nodded. The placement of the cups, 3 with saucers, 1 without. Iris always served tea in pairs. The cup without a saucer was meant for Thomas, but in the confusion, Iris took it herself. Mrs. Cresswell's face crumpled for a moment, but she recovered quickly. She had it coming, she whispered. She lied to everyone. She strung me along for years with promises, then cut me out of her will, as if I were nothing. She was frightened, said Miss Marple. But she didn't deserve to die for it. No, said Mrs. Cresswell bitterly. But I didn't mean to kill her. Thomas leaned back, pale. She was going to kill me. Miss Marple looked at him gently. I suspect she saw your presence as a threat, and your inheritance as a betrayal. Mrs. Cresswell said nothing more. Denham nodded to the constable by the door. You'll come with us now, ma'am. She rose quietly, dignity shattered but not gone, and followed the constable out. The room remained hushed. Miss Marple stood. Some tragedies, she said softly, don't end with justice. They end with understanding. Later that evening, the rain gave way to a silver mist, and the village returned to its uneasy calm. At the vicarage, Helena poured Miss Marple a fresh cup of tea. So she meant to kill Thomas, but Iris drank the tea instead. Yes, Miss Marple said, a mistake born from bitterness, and the blue envelope. Iris intended to destroy it, Miss Marple said, but guilt has a way of staying the hand. Helena sat down. And Edith Crane, poor child, Miss Marple said. She uncovered the truth too late. She never blackmailed anyone, only asked too many questions. I believe she returned in time. They sat in silence. Then Helena asked, and how did you know it was Mrs. Cresswell? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because she looked everywhere but at the tray. The guilty often fear seeing the thing they've hidden, even when it's right in front of them. The following Sunday, Bluebell Cottage stood empty again. The roses had begun to bloom along the trellis, and the last of the raindrops glittered on the petals like tiny jewels. Miss Marple passed the gate, paused, and looked up at the window where Iris once stood, watching the garden. A life of secrets, a death by misdirection. But, at last, the truth had found its home, and Miss Marple, thanked, unnoticed, and quietly victorious, walked on. The village, after all, would bloom again.